I want to just give very quickly verses. This is just going to be a couple of minutes. Every letter of Paul begins and ends with grace. Every single letter. Every single letter, he says something like, I come to you in the grace of God, by the grace of God, pray for the grace of God. Every letter ends within the grace of God. Every message Paul had was bookended with grace. He understood it. He had a revelation of it. We need that revelation. We need to drink 1,500-year-old, 200 proof grace. No ice, no ginger ale, the straight stuff. So I want you to tell me, this is Paul with a little dose of Peter, but mostly Paul. I want you to tell me if Paul is warning of too much grace. Galatians 1:6, I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Doesn't sound like a warning about grace. It sounds like a warning about deserting grace. Romans 1:5, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of the name of his name among all the Gentiles. Please note, it is grace that produces obedience. You want to know why Paul was so focused on grace? Because it's the only thing that's going to produce true obedience. An outward change in behavior is not obedience, it's compliance. Obedience is a change of heart. And a change of heart is a change of mind. The repentance that produces the outcome of obedience is all about properly understanding grace. Romans 6, thanks be to God that you were once slaves of sin, but you have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness. This is all out of the same revelation in the book of Romans that starts with the understanding that righteousness comes by grace through faith. Ephesians 1 and 2, Paul talks about the what is the language? The abundance of God's grace. And he even later talks about the increased abundance of God's grace. The letter to the Ephesians, he uses a word that is just, I'll get to it actually later in Romans. I want to see if I can find the specific passage here because I want to get the language right, and I'm not saying it the way I need to say it. The riches, not the abundance. The riches. In Ephesians 1, it's the riches of his grace. In Ephesians 2, it's the incomparable riches of his grace. And that word riches is the same word applied to God's wisdom and knowledge. Riches. How rich is God? What does the riches of God look like? When he says he is rich in wisdom and knowledge, does that mean he's got most of the wisdom and most of the knowledge? When it talks about the unfathomable, incomparable riches of wisdom and knowledge, is there a particular situation that God isn't really savvy to or needs to get the facts on? Like, God, I'd like to talk to you about this. Do you know anything about this? Hold on, I'm going to get my research team on this. That's actually an area where my rich knowledge is a little in deficit. I don't have full knowledge in that area. I have a really healthy dose of knowledge, but I'm lacking in some respects. No, it's the same word about riches that applies to grace. Is there a deficit or a lack of grace? Not in God. It's riches. Titus, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all people. This is similar to the passage in Romans where grace brings about the obedience of faith. Listen to what he tells Titus. The grace of God brings salvation. That's what we focus on. We focus on the gospel of salvation. But the grace of God has appeared, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. That's what grace does. It compensates for all of our weakness, and it actually disciples us in the ways of God. I want you to tell me if Paul is warning about too much grace in any of these passages. Peter says, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. Mind you, not added. You don't want grace plus grace. Peter says, let it be multiplied. Would you rather have 5 units of grace plus 5 units of grace, or 5 units of grace times 5 units of grace? I want the multiplier. Double down, multiply the snot out of that. I don't want just a little more grace. Peter says there is an exponential amount, a multiplier in how God relates, and he's actually praying for the multiplier. Imagine Paul, if he could just suddenly appear in our day and time and could go around to all of our modern conferences. And pastors are flocking to him, complaining of the immaturity of their people, the lack of consecration, the struggles with sin, the temptations of the age, the weakness and vice and constant backsliding. And that's among the committed. Paul's like, man, this is a problem. Conference here, conference there, over in Europe, down in Texas, up here in Canada, all around. He's like, okay, there's a real problem here. You know what? I'm going to go listen to what they're preaching so that I can understand how the people are being discipled. Is there going to be enough grace in the message to train us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age? Or is it going to be law that inspires the sin that the pastors have a problem with?